Hi everyone, welcome to another 5 minutes of British literature for this week's reading. Let's talk about the literary impact of the Civil Wars and the Restoration. Quick history. After Elizabeth I died in 1603, the English crown passed to her Scottish cousins, the House of Stuart. The Stuarts were enthusiastic believers in the divine right of kings, and while James I was decently diplomatic in how he asserted that belief, his successor Charles I was not. When Parliament pushed back against Charles's power, he dismissed Parliament and ruled by himself for the next decade. During this period, the dissenters built up their religious and political power, and when Charles I had to call Parliament back into session, dissenters made up an impressive portion of that body. And they had a lot of demands to present to the king in exchange for the money that he needed, especially when it came to religious reforms and limits on the monarch's power. The dissenters were pretty radical Protestants, and they were deeply suspicious of Charles's Catholic sympathies. The relationship between Charles and the dissenters deteriorated when he started arresting members of Parliament and then fled north to gather his own army in 1642. Thus, the English Civil Wars began, and they ravaged the country until 1648, when Charles I was finally captured, tried for treason, and executed in early 1649. Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the dissenters' army, took charge of England under the self-given title of Lord Protector, and ruled until his death in 1658. The Civil Wars and the Interregnum, the period with no monarchy, made a huge impact on English culture and literature. The destruction of the violence, the divisions among the English people, and the upheaval of dissenter governance turned England into a country interrupted in a lot of ways. We see Thomas Hobbes focus on these negative effects of the Civil Wars in Leviathan, where he writes of a nation's need for a strong ruler who can provide order and security. Without order and security, he says, a society's industry, art, and progress will grind to a halt, because no one will invest in projects with an uncertain future. And to some extent, he was right. The dissenters shut down the theaters, which had been epicenters of English art and literature for decades, so very little new drama was produced in this period. The wars drove many royalist writers into exile in Europe, where they became known as the Cavaliers. As men without a country or a secure future, these writers produced a lot of poetry that focused on living in the moment and enjoying whatever happiness you can find when you can find it. A sentiment known as carpe diem, or seize the day. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. On the other hand, the Civil Wars and the Interregnum fueled a period that produced a lot of great nonfiction writing from across the political spectrum. Some political tracts, some religious tracts, and a lot of personal writing as well. Since the dissenter government put the enforcement of censorship laws on the back burner at the beginning of the wars, we see a mini explosion of pamphlets, tracts, and essays that were able to circulate far more widely than they would have been under Charles I. Hobbes's Leviathan became a classic work of English political philosophy, and Thomas Browne's Religio Medici is one of the most moving meditations on religion and tolerance in English literature. This period also opened the doors for dissenting authors to reach more prominence than they would have under Charles I. Case in point, John Milton. As a dissenter, Milton would have found it nearly impossible to get any of his writing through the Privy Council or the Church of England hierarchy. However, the Civil Wars and Interregnum made it possible for him to distribute his tracts promoting the dissenter cause, including an essay in defense of regicide. Even Paradise Lost contains echoes of the Civil Wars, even though it was published after the Restoration. The monarchy was restored in 1660, when Charles II returned to England from exile in France and claimed the crown that had last been held by his executed father. If anyone hoped for a return to the old regime, those hopes were probably short-lived. Charles II brought back the pomp of the monarchy and introduced more religious tolerance into his reign, but Parliament would never again tolerate anything less than a co-equal role in governing England. Charles also brought a more libertine atmosphere to the royal court, which set the tone for court-adjacent literary and artistic cultures. He was a bit of a rake who enjoyed entertainment, theater, and fine things. While many upper-class English welcomed the more morally relaxed reign of Charles II, his playboy ways did not inspire respect or stabilize his line of succession, and they became subject to a lot of trepidation and mockery. More on that next week when we take a look at Restoration comedy. But for this week, thank you for watching.